Hello, and welcome to Spotlights, the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and this week I'm really happy to welcome onto the show Daniel Scheid. Dan, thanks for making time for us.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
So, for those who aren't familiar with you, you're Director of Undergraduate Studies and Associate Professor of Theology at Duquesne University. And you have this wonderful new book out, which I'll show to the camera for folks who are watching, The Cosmic Common Good, Religious Grounds for Ecological Ethics, which is a really wonderful book. So I'm excited to chat with you about it.
Thank you.
But first, I want to hear a little bit more background about you, because this world of religious approaches to environmental ethics, that's a unique kind of approach to things. A lot of times it's like you're either going to study religion or you're going to think about environmental issues. You know, pick
Right.
spirit or matter. You can't do both. And then to think about it in terms of comparative religion, that's also, really broadening your horizons. A lot of people are like, I'll just stick with the tradition I was raised in. Too much to learn from other things. So how did you get on this kind of path, thinking about these kind of issues?
That's a great question to start with. So yeah, thank you again for having me here today. Just a little bit about I was thinking about this in my own mind and trying to retrace the steps of how I got here. So I was born and raised in Chicago, youngest of four, and raised in a Catholic family. So Catholic faith and tradition were very important to me. And I can come back to some of that a little bit later. But as I started to get more involved in my faith tradition in college, I started visiting a soup kitchen run by the Franciscans in Philadelphia. And caring for the poor and caring for others was always an important part of the Catholic tradition. And now I was finally kind of living it in my own direct experience. And reading Dorothy Day and people like that, I began to see the works of mercy and feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless as being just a vital expression of faith. So that's how I kind of got into that. I spent a year volunteering with the Franciscans after college, and it was there that I spent a weekend focusing on justice, peace, and the integrity of creation. And up to that point, justice was very important, peace was important, and the integrity of creation was definitely a third place. And one of my best friends in college decided to devote himself to environmentalism and sustainability, and he and I had long conversations. And I said, I see the value of this, but definitely my primary concern would be love of my fellow human beings. That weekend was all devoted to the work of Thomas Berry. And I began antithetical at first, a little resentful, frankly, like, oh, we should be working on global poverty. But by the end of the weekend, I was converted. I said, oh, this is a story that brings everything together and actually brought in some pieces of my own life that I hadn't thought of. I loved exploring forests, walking along rivers, swimming in oceans, just being outside, playing outside. I guess I hadn't really put that as part of a spiritual identity, but Thomas Berry helped me see this is why amidst a world of plenty and industrialism, we still have people who are hungry. And this is why you have these wonderful experiences of the divine in nature, but our world is not set up to understand that or explain it to you or facilitate it. So that's how I got kind of into Thomas Berry, thinking cosmologically, seeing that as a part of my faith. And then I've always been interested in other cultures, and it was in my master's program studying with Bob Schreiter at Catholic Theological Union, which is a great place to study theology. They had people studying theology from all continents, six of the seven continents.
Right.
So the question was always not what does the church teach, but what does the church teaching mean among in Papua New Guinea? What does it mean in Argentina? What does it mean in and so it was always a matter of seeing how do we speak about God and faith across different cultural identities and boundaries, and that I just love that interplay of speaking out to people who are from a different background but trying to find something common. So this is a long answer, so I apologize. So then when I went to study at Boston College, I said, I want to do what's known as comparative theology. And I knew nothing of Hinduism or Buddhism. I just decided I'm going to study with Frank Clooney and I'm going to learn Hinduism and then John McCransky as well, and I learned some Buddhism. So yeah, it's eclectic for sure, but that's how all the different pieces came together.
Nice. I like that
Yeah.
a lot. Yeah, similar for me too. You know, I was studying philosophy and religious studies in college, and would hear people talking about environmental ethics. I'm like, good for you guys. And then eventually, like, oh, right, of course. If, of course, this is central to everything I should be working on and so important and enlivening and nourishing. So yeah, it's funny to be reluctant. Be like, well, I like being outdoors, but I don't want to like study it.
Right,
It's a
right.
different world. Yeah, and I really appreciate the emphasis on interreligious dialogue and thinking across cultures. I feel like that's especially after, Vatican II, it's like this is really the responsibility of Catholics to learn about other faiths and find the truth in them and see what that means for Catholicism.
Right,
So to me, it's like, well, we got to be doing this. How are more people not doing this?
right, right.
So I like the way the book is set up because you have this that sensibility. You're connecting to the environment. You're connecting across cultures, across religions, and the thing that really caught my eye when I first saw it was that you're talking about the common good,
Mm,
and which is something that I don't know, especially during the pandemic, we saw some people weren't super concerned about the common good,
right.
and it's just like, oh, what happened to that? It's such a key concept and so important for our society. So I
Yeah.
wonder if you could say a little bit about the common good, and especially why it's a cosmic common good.
Yeah, so the common good is a central, it's a cornerstone principle of Catholic social thought, Catholic social teaching. And the basic idea is from the Vatican document Gaudium et Spes, the sum total of conditions that allow individuals and various groups to reach their full fulfillment. So it's what are the conditions of the group that allow each individual person to become most fully alive and attain their full flourishing. So in the book, I try to say a few things about why focusing on dignity, human dignity first, which is common in many Catholic circles, is not adequate. And it's not adequate ecologically, but I think it's also danger in America and in the context of American individualism, where a focus on human dignity can become my dignity
Yeah.
or my rights. And to stress that we first and well, not foremost, but we definitely our very identity is to belong to each other, and that we cannot be fully who we are meant to be, and we can't really fully be happy unless we are contributing to a common good. The common good of the family is a really obvious one. A lot of my students resonate with the common good of a team or an orchestra, the common good of Duquesne, and the common good of coming together. It, as you know, the papal tradition, popes would say the common good needs to expand to the limits of our interdependence.
Mhm.
And as our world becomes more global and more interdependent, more reliant on each other, that's how far the common good needs to stretch. So, why would the common good be cosmic? I have a few different arguments for that in the book. First of all, it must be more than just the human common good, because human beings are not simply living in a backdrop of nature that is always steady, always secure, a given, as it has been for much of human history, but we know that it's not anymore. It never really was, but it certainly isn't now.
Right.
In that our identity is bound up evolutionarily with the history of the entire universe. It's bound up ecologically, that what's happening in the rest of the planet is in our blood, it's in our lungs, and the living systems of the earth are in danger. And so that shows how connected we are. Why cosmic? It's interesting. Some people said, "Isn't this really a planetary common good?" And I kept
Mm.
thinking, no, it's got to be more than that. And part of it is a theological reason, although some of the scientific reasons I think are interesting too. But theologically, I think we need to expand our vision to the utmost, to the divine, to God, who is the creator of the entire universe. And Larry Rasmussen says at one point, if you think of a God who is focused just on human history, you are thinking of a God who is far too small.
Mm.
That we need a God of the entire scope of the universe, the entire duration of the universe, and something that challenges our human anthropocentrism or just our human egocentrism
Mhm.
to make how do we see what I'm doing related to the entire cosmos For me, it's a challenge, but I like that challenge, and I like thinking about how what we're doing is important for the planet, and to highlight how sacred and important this planet is to our knowledge in the scope of the universe. What the Earth is doing is cosmically singular as far as we know. So that really what we're doing has cosmic dimensions.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me of Thomas Berry saying that ecology is functional cosmology. Right?
Yeah,
It's like,
good.
no,
So I
this is
probably
where
got
it's
it from
happening.
Thomas Berry is really what it,
That's
it's what it
true.
comes down to.
That's always an easy answer. Well, Thomas said it, so I just
And the other Thomas Aquinas. Yeah, that
It's true. A couple good Thomases. Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was thinking like even the fact that Earth wouldn't really have the energy it has if we didn't have a relationship to the sun. And so
Right.
it's hard to think about Earth as this kind of just in a void somewhere. It's like, no, we're part of this cosmic evolutionary dynamic. And
Yeah.
even looking up at the starry night above us and, seeing the Milky Way, like we're connected far beyond just the atmosphere around the Earth.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my book, I had a little piece as I was thinking about it. Why cosmic? So human beings have stretched out to clearly the moon. We have a whole circle of stellar junk that is encircling the planet. We've sent satellites out beyond the solar system at this point. So we have a solar systemic galactic presence.
Yeah.
But I love your point too. Just staring up at the stars, we have a bond. We have a bond to the entire universe of which we're a part.
Yeah, that's always influenced our imaginations and our faith traditions and literature, and so yeah, hard to think of the Earth in isolation. I get why people would want to because it's a lot to take on. The Earth is already so much. And you're like, no, we got to get to a couple extra trillion galaxies. And you're like, okay, wow, this is big.
Yeah, ethics of a nation state are pretty
Yeah,
complex.
yeah,
Cosmic
exactly.
ethics is a challenge.
Yeah, even just trying to get along with roommates and things like
Right? Yeah, right. Yeah,
that.
exactly. Yeah.
Like, no, we're thinking about the whole 13.8 billion year journey of the universe. Like, oh, that's going to be a lot.
Though, I just, and I'm curious what you think about this. Could it also be a source of inspiration and motivation? Can it also say that I'm not doing this struggle with my roommate isn't just this tiny little moment in this tiny little part on Earth. I'm connected to this huge, massive process.
Yeah.
I try to tell my students too, gather some inspiration from the fact that you have within you evolutionarily inherited traits that go back millions of years.
Yeah.
A lot of history that's alive in you right now.
Yeah, I think that's such an important shift in perspective because it's easy. I've had students that kind of react that way, teaching them a little bit about the universe story, and they're like, "This makes me feel small." And I'm like,
Mm.
"There's another way to look at it, where you actually be like, oh, I'm made of like the whole universe is somehow inside of me, even knowing like the carbon atoms in our body were prototyped in ancient generation stars. It's just like we're literally made of stardust. It's true, and so the songs are true."
The songs are true.
And so
That's
it's like,
right.
yeah, it takes a little practicing to get that perspective down. But once you do, then yeah, reflecting on your place in the universe really is this kind of enlivening experience. You feel so connected and
Yeah.
so big, but in a way that keeps you humble because you're clearly not in charge of it.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. And it's not all for me. It's not just
Yeah.
gearing up to this one moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so along those lines, when you're looking at religion and how focusing on the common good can help us respond to today's ecological crises, what were some of the things that you were finding? Because that's obviously, a big part of this whole podcast and the whole field of religion ecology is exactly this kind of work. And I like the idea of focusing on the cosmic common good to draw out these possible contributions that religions have. So what were some of the themes and ideas you found most prominent?
So, in addition to in anthropology, understanding of the human person that's connected to the planet and connected to the cosmos, or even thinking in my own Catholic tradition of God not just as maker of the covenant with humans, but God as creator, I wanted to think in terms of ethical categories because I thought that might be a little less contentious, and especially looking at Catholic social teaching. So what is the common good? These are these kind of mediating middle level principles that take the cosmos down into, okay, so how do we think about COVID-19? Well, we have to balance things like personal dignity and safety versus the common good, which includes economics and politics. We should probably bring in subsidiarity. All these principles of Catholic social teaching, I think, are really helpful. They don't provide easy answers, clearly. But I thought it could further a conversation in terms of endangered species or wilderness. What is the role of wilderness for us in a human society? Are human beings the predator that we need to protect this thing from us? Do we need to integrate humans with wilderness? Do we need to eventually do that? And for me, I'm trying to combine this big scope vision of what is ultimately the human role with what are some principles we could actually work our way through.
Right.
I'm not sure if I'm answering your question here, but so I haven't done as much applied. So what does this look like when it comes to fresh water, access to fresh water in the Southwest? But I do think they're going to be increasingly vital, because we're going to need to balance economic interests from different parties who want water for different things. We need to see economics as subsidiary to the human common good as a whole, and to see our relationship to all these different creatures, to rehabilitating ecosystems so that they can be more supportive of life in general than maybe they are currently. I think these principles, the virtue of solidarity and seeing what our role is, along with some of the other principles that challenge and critique the more narrow vision that I see in economics only, free market only, human beings only. Technology is the only means we can use to get our way out of the situation.
Right.
So at this point, it's a little frustrating, because I think it's more of a critical role pushing back against what I see as the dominant way of thinking. Getting it to generate real world solutions can be a bit harder. But I don't know if this might be one of your later questions, what are the signs of hope that I see? I think people are already doing this. I think many of the people who are doing this are non-religious in nature. And I think that some of the religious imagery and religious language, even these ethical principles that Catholics have that have resonance in Buddhist tradition, indigenous tradition, Hindu tradition, I think my hope is that many people would find this attractive, that many people would say, oh, this is a much more balanced way. I didn't anticipate agreeing with religious language as much as I do, but I think this is a really helpful way of describing what it is that I've been working towards.
Yeah, and especially when you put it in a comparative context, I feel like one of the things that will turn people off about religion is they feel like they're being asked to convert to something. It can feel very preachy, right? And when you're kind of comparing things, you're like, I'm not just saying, hey, Catholicism's right. There's a lot of ways to bring this kind of religious thinking and feeling into your life. So
Right.
it's a more gentle way, and people are like, oh, okay. Thought you were just trying to get me to go to church or something.
Yeah, right.
You're like, no, there's a little more there. You mentioned subsidiarity. It's one of my favorite things from Catholic social teaching. I think it's such a powerful concept. And so, for folks who aren't that familiar with Catholic social teaching, I wonder if you could say more about it, because I think it's very valuable and for all kinds of issues, but including ecological issues.
Yeah, and feel free to add on to what I'm saying here, because I'd be curious how you define it and use it. But subsidiarity is a principle that tries to help coordinate different sectors of society. So those who are higher or more distant and more remote, like federal government, with increasingly intermediate and more local, decentralized forms like local government. So that government's one example that you could use, but that decisions should be made by the people who are closest to the problem and who are most affected by it. So those people and their voices should be privileged as much as possible, so that the role of further away organizations is to provide support and help
Yeah.
to enable them to address the problems that they have. When the problems, though, start to transcend local populations and the problems seems to expand and magnify, then decisions might need to be made at a more remote or more general, more broad level, even if that has local implications. So it's a bit of a tension, but it's a way of negotiating how does the individual person or a small intermediate group like my family fit into the common good, and how do we negotiate who makes decisions here?
Nice. I like that a lot. And I think one of the things people just, usual kind of prejudices or biases about like what the Catholic Church is, people think it's a very top-down hierarchy. And like, yeah, I can see where it might look like that. And in some cases, historically, has certainly acted like that.
Right.
But subsidiarity is like, no, it's like a grassroots organization. And then the only reason there's higher levels is precisely to coordinate things that are bigger than the local. And, it's really for the lower levels. And so it's not just top down at all. The top is always listening to those lower levels and really encouraging them. All right, you take it on your own.
Right.
So it's not the heavily centralized system that it looks like. Oh, the Pope in Rome. It's all about Rome. And I got that growing up Catholic around mostly Protestant community in Texas. People would kind of tell me, you're not really American because you follow the Pope in Rome. And I was like, oh wow, okay. I didn't know people thought that.
I didn't
Very
know people
strange.
still thought that,
Yeah,
but
right. Yeah, there's a pocket of people in Texas that certainly do. I was like,
okay,
what
yeah.
decade is this?
Right, yeah.
I was like 10 at the time, and so I think that might have been the start for me. I'm thinking like I think we need to think about religious difference because it's clearly people have some weird misconceptions about one another, and I think if we
Right,
had more dialogue, we'd realize we have more common ground than we realize.
right, yeah.
So, on that note, I wonder what some of the common ground you found when you're comparing Christianity with Buddhism, Hinduism, indigenous traditions. What were some of the interesting things that were cropping up for you?
So with this idea of the common good and trying to figure out how one member of a community fits into a wider whole, and thinking about it in terms of doctrines of creation, I found a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. But what are some of the common ground? In Hinduism, there was such a strong, especially in the readings that I was doing, I was looking at theocentric traditions in Hinduism because Hinduism is incredibly
Right.
diverse. So that said, given I was looking at theocentric ones, such a strong sense of theocentrism, or that all belongs to the divine, that every creature that you see, its fundamental innermost identity
Mm.
is the divine. It did help me read Aquinas and say, oh, wow, there's a lot of theological common ground here. Buddhism lacks a creator God, and yet the core vision is of codependent origination, or
Mhm.
what Thich Nhat Hanh calls interdependence.
Right.
That there is no core solid identity to any individual. It's always a matter of understanding how anything that arises is inherently related to everything else. One thing that I liked about the dialogue with Buddhism that I started thinking and bringing back into my own Catholic tradition is, for Thich Nhat Hanh and for the Buddha, understanding interdependence or codependent origination and its relationship to karma and our action is essentially liberating. And especially for Thich Nhat Hanh, understanding our interdependence with the planet is a primary way of letting go of egocentrism,
Right.
in a way of bringing about peace. And he even says, "Will conquer your fear of death." I thought, wow, that's so. What conquers the fear of death in Christianity? It would be the love of God, and what God has brought about for us through Jesus Christ. But I thought, and seeing ourselves as part of this bigger, broader, interconnected creation. And so that, yeah, that's it. So that's a kind of way in which the common ground brought me to see my own tradition a little differently and say, liturgically, how do the aspects of creation show up in the Mass, in the Catholic Mass? They're certainly present.
Yeah.
Now they're more highlighted, and now I can see how seeing their identity as aspects of creation brings me even further into God and some of the aspects of peace that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about. The indigenous traditions too, talking about harmony and reciprocity and balance. Caring for creation should bring about greater peace, or those two should be united. They're kind of a justice, peace, and the integrity of creation, as my early Franciscans talked about, and seeing the importance of our actions having a reciprocity with the rest of creation, which is a way of, it's another way of seeing the common good. But one thing I liked about especially the Lakota was putting it in terms of place. And I don't do this often enough and well enough, but seeing myself really as inhabiting an ecosystem and a place, and the water and the food and the sunshine and the people and the very indigenous people who aren't here, or they are here,
Right.
but they're not here in the way they were before.
Yeah.
But they're here. And even bringing that kind of consciousness to mind, well, they're gone now. No, they're not gone now. They're here, and they still inhabit this ecosystem as well. Yeah, that there's just so much common ground in terms of pursuit of justice, in terms of understanding how we're related to the rest of the world, and to each other. There's so much there, but also difference. I want to highlight there is difference, and the difference makes the conversation worthwhile too.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, especially like with Buddhism, be like, yeah, we don't have a creator God.
Right.
Like that's kind of essential to what we're doing.
Right.
And so like, I don't know, where are we going to start? And you find,
Right.
well, interdependence. We can, there are things we can work with.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I think of folks like Thomas Merton, who got so involved with Buddhist dialogue and even translated the Zhuangzi from Taoism, and he's like, yeah, this is great. This is enriching my own Catholic faith to have these kind of conversations.
Right. Right.
Um, and think of Franciscans, by the way, in relationship to indigenous traditions. It's kind of a disaster. I know in California, Franciscans were really responsible for or complicit in a lot of native genocide.
Yeah.
So terrible, terrible kind of legacy.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, now we have a pope who's taken the name of Francis, and he's recently offered an apology for a lot of these actions. Of course, you're like, well, those are just words. Let's see what kind of actions can come from it. But that it seems like your work with this kind of interreligious dialogue is part of the same kind of reconciliation. Like, look, we know things have been very disparate in the past, and there's been a lot of tensions, but we can come together and learn to speak with one another in the interest of the common good. And so to me, Catholic and indigenous dialogue, so powerful right now.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. And it's important that especially in that kind of dynamic, that words don't just stay words, that words, as you said earlier, are rooted in listening.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
A listening church.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's such a noble goal. And for all organizations, really, for the church and everybody. It's like, a little listening wouldn't hurt.
Right.
Just
Right.
listen. And like, oh, I don't need to listen. I've got the right answer. Like, a little listening might be a good idea.
Especially here.
Yeah, geez. Well, I wonder, we're talking about some of the things that religions can really contribute to our thinking about ecology, the cosmic common good. What are some of the obstacles? There's the usual thing of like, well, there's too much anthropocentrism in religion. I wonder if there's things like that. Where do you see the obstacles to religion engaging more with ecological issues? Like, why aren't they doing it more already? There's so many good concepts and teachings for them to really engage, to care, to repair the world. And yet they've been kind of dragging their feet a little bit.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think one of the big obstacles or hindrances, and this is not my specialty, but in terms of political analysis, is that they're concerned about the viability of their organizations. So I'm thinking in terms of universities, churches.
Right.
They're seeing people leave, and they're seeing their longevity threatened. And so reasonably, they're worried about their own individual, not individual, but their smaller common good.
Yeah.
The message that we want to provide to the world won't take root if we don't continue to exist. At the same time, I think they might overlook the way in which some of these this message and these endeavors will draw people to the church, not in a not in a subterfuge where we just want you to come to church with us. But I think there might be a way in which there's interest in this, and there's desire for people to say, I think there's a different way of living, and there's a different way in which we could be community. I don't know if it's going to be centered on the liturgy the way that the church might see as its primary value. But yeah, I see in my own in Pittsburgh, the church is trying to preserve itself, and some people see Laudato Si as a way of being church, but I think more and more people are just saying, what are the core ideas that we need to give our kids, and how do we get people to stay part of this community? I think some of the old historical identity wars, people think that's the way to maintain your Catholic identity. I think can be a distraction, and I think it can be a real hindrance. People hyper focus on the Catholic faith equals something about gender identity, or this one, these few social issues. And so that I think they're missing a huge evangelization opportunity if they don't see religion and ecology or Laudato Si as a way of expressing who God is, in a way that I think a lot of people would be receptive to.
Yeah, right. That really would be a kind of win-win for the church, and because it's like, look, you'll get more people coming because they feel like you're speaking to their real needs and their real issues. So you kind of get attendance up while actually helping the world be a better place to live in, and work to, having cleaner air, cleaner water, and access to nutritious food, and like basic things that people are like, okay, I like that. Most people like to have clean water and a stable climate and things like that. It's like, yeah, this is kind of low hanging fruit. And they're like, oh, that's not our message. I wonder if you could say a little bit about Laudato Si, because especially, like some of the conservative Catholics in the United States really don't seem to like Pope Francis like at all. And then Laudato Si in particular, they've been pretty resistant to. So I wonder what's going on there. Why is there this rift with people not? Because I know for me in my circle, when Laudato Si came out, everybody's just like, "Yay, this is just wonderful."
Yes.
And so I just thought everybody was really excited and was like, "What a fun pope we got! This is really exciting. First Jesuit pope, first Latin American pope, great." And then apparently a bunch of pushback. Like, what's going on there?
Great question. So this is how to interpret church politics in some ways. And in America, I think American Catholics and a lot of Christians, evangelical Christians, really bought into the idea that communism is atheism and that capitalism is Christian.
Right.
And so anything that challenges an economic message sometimes can be seen as opposed to faith in a very strange way, where I feel like John Paul II had some more what's the word, when Nixon goes to China, John Paul can critique capitalism, because people knew where he stood on communism, but in more recent years, people, I think, just have these long-term lingering suspicions. And I think they have this idea of true Catholic faith equals blank, equals anti-modern, pro-market. Which to my mind, those are two opposing forces, but they combine them in some way.
Yeah, it confuses me. I'm like, yeah, anti-modern. Yeah, there's so many problems with modernization. They're like, free markets are great. I'm like, wait, what?
Those two came about together.
Like, I miss the good old days of free markets in the ancient world. Like,
Yeah,
that's
right,
not how
right.
that operated.
No, exactly. Yeah, I almost let's go back to more of Thomas Aquinas's
Yeah,
not all, but yeah, but some of them let's critique usury
yeah,
and see how that might change the way we live together.
yeah. I think of that with the kind of debates about student loan forgiveness in the United States right now. I'm like,
Right.
the forgiveness of debts is kind of a big part of the tradition.
That's
It's
right.
weird that people would be resisting that at all. Like, it's really written pretty deeply into what we do here.
Right, right.
Yeah, and I think also, Pope Francis has been kind of accused of being Marxist and such and communist. I remember once in some kind of speech, somebody asked him about it, and he was like, "Well, I've met some Marxists, and they seem like nice folks." And he's like, "Oh, you could just relax a little, everybody, just a
No,
little bit.
no. Right, 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 right. Yeah.
Shouldn't be so tough."
No,
Uh,
it really shouldn't be. Yeah.
yeah, and I wonder, talking about Pope Francis, especially, he's really encouraging Catholic universities to get involved and to do something for the earth. I think Jesuit universities in particular, he's highlighting, but Catholic universities in general.
Right.
So I wonder what's going on at Duquesne. Because I know, I'm in a Catholic university, University of San Francisco,
Yeah.
and we're trying to do stuff, but there's always the issue of greenwashing, where universities can just do a little, and then they're going to put something up on their website saying, "Look, we're sustainable," and all that kind of stuff. And you're like, are you doing as much as you should be?
Right.
And so yeah, I'm curious what kind of initiatives are happening, whether at the kind of administrative level, or even just like with student groups and student interest in these kind of issues. And so yeah, happy just to hear about the Duquesne ecosystem.
Right. Yeah. Duquesne is interesting because long before I got there, they've been doing some sustainability
Hmm.
initiatives that were really pioneering. They have a natural gas cogeneration plant that's been on campus for 30 years, I think.
Oh wow.
Quite a long time.
Hmm.
So some sustainability endeavors have been around a long time. On the other hand, they so far have been more happening in particular departments, not theology, biology, but Center for Environmental Research has been leading the way. Just recently, we started a university sustainability committee, not so much to start something totally new, but to bring together all the different forces that were there.
Hmm.
So I think Duquesne has had some really, really good initiatives in the past, but we're a little bit behind. Georgetown has a Center for Sustainability, has a director of sustainability. Our local partners here, Pitt, for example, has a director of sustainability.
Hmm.
We don't have that yet.
Hmm.
But I think we're moving we're moving in the right direction. And one thing that I always say, and I think the president would agree with me on this, Pitt is a leader in healthcare and in health.
Hmm.
Um, Carnegie Mellon is a leader in artificial intelligence and robotics. Duquesne is a leader in ethics.
Hmm.
And so one thing I want us to be is that leader in sustainability and in ethics and in bringing disparate voices together in the public sphere. Because I think that's something Catholic universities could be really, really good at. And so we're starting to do that. But in terms of the student groups, Duquesne has a very active sustainability group, Evergreen. We have a lot of association with groups in Africa based on the Spiritans.
Hmm.
That's our religious organization, the
Oh.
Spiritans, who are small compared to the Jesuits, but have some really innovative ways of being with people. In fact, back in the day, he said, unlike our Jesuits who go as missionaries to make little mini Europeans, I want you to be African with the Africans. That's what he said in the
Nice.
1800s.
That's great.
So the Spartans are really good at journeying with people and walking alongside them. So one group went to Tanzania and started a water program that has been going for 10 years or more now.
Oh, cool.
So that's kind of justice, but also environmental. So I think that's something that Catholic universities could do really well.
Mhm.
Bring the environmental justice lens into sustainability really clearly.
Yeah, I like that a lot. the African with the Africans. Jesuits trying to turn people into mini Europeans. That's funny. Sad,
Yeah,
sad but true.
you go to some parish. I've been told, I haven't visited, but you went to some parishes and they're singing German songs, in
Oh, too
in
funny.
Africa, and you're saying, where are we? Yeah. Um,
That's good. Yeah, and I agree with you about justice for sure. That seems like, I mean, it's such a core value for really all the Abrahamic traditions. And so it seems like a really easy way into the environmental discourse. It's like, look, I'm not saying you just have to love nature for nature.
right,
It's a justice problem. So at the
right,
very least, interact with it that way.
right, right.
And then eventually, hopefully, we can inspire you to just love the whole universe. but but as a kind of entry point, yeah, I think justice is a good way to go.
Isn't it interesting too? I feel like Sierra Club, the ASHE, the American Association for or Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Ed, a lot of different groups are justice is now one of the core
Yeah,
pillars of their sustainability work.
yeah.
So there's just even more common ground between environmental groups and Catholic universities.
I wonder, comparing to like Eastern traditions, right, like Buddhism and Hinduism or indigenous traditions,
Yeah.
is justice a value there, or is there another concept or something that kind of intersects with what the more Western ideas about justice? 'Cause I know not everybody's really using that word, and of course, even in the West, the modern kind of secular idea of justice is very different than the more
Right.
ancient idea come from the Bible or from Plato and Aristotle. So many different justices.
Right.
So yeah, I'm curious. And for Hinduism, Buddhism, indigenous, was justice showing up there in any kind of way?
Uh, so good, that's a really good point. And in broad strokes, justice tends to be more of the prophetic Abrahamic Western
Yeah,
traditions, and of the Eastern ones, Buddhism and Hinduism, um, less so. So that the spiritual traditions, as you know, some of these are really broad generalizations going back hundreds of years. That Eastern traditions are more about transcending the world, and Western ones are
right,
more about transforming the world. And it's not that simple, but there is some truth to it. Thich Nhat Hanh and his idea of engaged Buddhism is more of a modern idea, that
right,
to be fully Buddhist or very authentically Buddhist is to be actively working towards changing social structures. For him, though, even there, though, I don't think justice would be the vision. It would be compassion.
right.
And he even said, interestingly, some of his Catholic friends who said, we need to fight these folks. He said, I don't want to fight anyone. Even the CEO of the corporation who's directly polluting, that's not an enemy for me.
Yeah.
It's someone I have to work with. I think Paul Nitter has that anecdote too.
Hmm.
Um, so that yeah, and in the indigenous thinking of George Tinker and some other ones, the justice would be in terms of sovereignty
Hmm.
for their people. Um, uh, Rightly so, not justice for everyone, but let's look at what's happened to our people
Right.
foremost. Um, and maybe then that example of sovereignty would be helpful to other
Yeah.
communities out there.
Yeah.
No, but you're right that justice is in some ways it isn't a term that's universal, but I think some of the goals of justice
Right.
would be very much a common ground.
That's a nice way to put it. And a good example is sometimes it's the differences between the religions that kind of provide some nice generative ground for dialogue. Like, well, if
Right,
we all already had a concept of justice, we wouldn't really have a very rich conversation.
right,
And so to see those differences, you can really reflect, okay, the justice does have some unique properties to it. We can do some stuff with that idea. And compassion has some unique things that the Buddhists can do with it. And those can intersect. But yeah, especially like the point about, the CEO of like a major, fossil fuel company or something, you'd be like, not my enemy. Whereas the prophetic tradition is going to be a little more like, no, let's fight it out.
yeah. The voices of the poor cry out against you.
Yeah.
No, that's not. I
Yeah.
want to engage him.
It's good, it's like if you're gonna be that way, it's nice to have a Buddhist around to keep you a little more
Yeah, right,
mellow.
exactly.
Be like, all right, relax a little bit, tone down the rhetoric. But that is a tough one. If anybody, to imagine like being like, no, that's still not my enemy. I would think CEOs of major fossil fuel companies, those would be some of the most triggering people
Right,
to just be like, no, stay calm, be peace. I was like, oh, that's easier said than done, Thich Nhat Hanh.
right, right. Yeah, no, yeah. What this mining company did to this town, um, my compassion's with them.
Yeah,
The people, not with all people. Yeah, so
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a tough one. I like your point about tribal sovereignty as well. That's such a big issue. And I know, some of the folks around the San Francisco Bay Area, we have, Ohlone people, Coast Miwok, Pomo. And I know some folks in these communities, and it is like the struggle of there's people who really pay lip service to them, land acknowledgements everywhere. Everybody's doing land acknowledgements. And it's like, great, if you could do a little more than acknowledge that you're on, contested, stolen land, and maybe help us get some rights to it again. Indigenous reparations, land back initiatives. I think that's such exciting work. And I hear examples of it here and there, but there's still such a long way to go. And it's
yeah,
interesting to think, well, the Catholic idea of justice could help motivate some of those kind of initiatives, even though the indigenous communities aren't necessarily worried about the word justice.
right,
And it's like, yeah, well, that's fine. You don't need to be, but this will be what motivates this community to
right.
help get some land back initiatives going.
Yeah, yep, yep.
Yeah. I like that. I don't know. It's one of the things I want to see more of in general in the field of religion ecology is exactly this kind of comparative thinking. And I feel like it's still not that popular just because maybe academic work always pushes people to just such specialization
Right,
that then by the time they're going to be doing research and writing, they're like, oh, I only really know this one tradition, not comfortable speaking across these boundaries.
right.
I wonder, have you come into any kind of problems with that, of like people who are more rooted in these traditions who are like, hey, you don't know the whole story, you're not a deep specialist in like Buddhist studies or something. Has there been any tension that way or any obstacles? Because really for me, because I like to do this work, I'd like to know, but also for any other listeners or viewers we have, what are some of the things to keep an eye out for when you want to do comparative work, interreligious work? Because you
Yeah,
end up stepping on everybody else's territory. You're talking about Buddhism, the Buddhist studies, people are like, hey, you don't know Sanskrit and Pali and Chinese and Tibet,
yep.
and so you don't know the primary sources. How dare you? So, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And maybe some of it is just my foolhardiness or my wanton disregard for for academic specialization. Personally, I've found people very supportive in the religion and ecology group. People are so welcoming. I think in part, I don't know why, but I think in part because the situation is so dire. We need as many people as possible to be
Yeah,
contributing whatever they can in whatever way they can.
yeah,
So now is not the time to be critiquing someone's interpretation of Pali unless
yeah,
it's really necessary. And even in my own Catholic community, people are generous in saying this seems valid and this seems maybe too this claim would be too far to go.
yeah.
What I've tried to do as much as possible is identify someone in a different tradition to follow as closely as possible.
Right.
So I'm going to follow Joanna Macy and Thich Nhat Hanh. I'm going to follow George Tinker. I'm going to follow Pankaj Jain and other people, and to try to dialogue with as many people as possible to say, does this sound like an adequate representation of your community? So far, I've found people are gracious, welcoming, glad that people are taking the time. Hindu dialogue partners are usually surprised. What are you doing here? And I admit, I don't read Tamil. I don't read Sanskrit. But does this sound accurate?
Yeah.
And so people are usually very welcoming. And I think Pope Francis, I know Wendell Berry, I think, has said something like this too. We need to risk being amateurs,
Mm,
and especially in this era of planetary crisis, we need more dialogues with people who don't know exactly, who are not perfect experts, but who are amateurs, which comes from ama to love. People who
Right.
want to do this out of love, love of earth, love of God, love of each other, to make that risk. And I am maybe it's just I don't mind being embarrassed in this way, so that when someone says you totally missed this, I'll say, okay, oh well. It was the motivation was good, I think, and so let's see if we can gather ourselves and try again. So I would encourage people to do that, but it definitely can't be done alone. So the scholar sitting alone with the text that they have mastered,
Right.
that's not the vision here. The vision here is dialogues with people who could say, this is a really good point. I think this is valuable. This might have gone too far. And I've been really, I've been very encouraged with the number of people who've come back and said, I'm not Catholic, but I think what you've said of my tradition is accurate and is good.
That's great.
Yeah.
Love that. Yeah, risk being amateurs. That's good. That's good advice. Think of, like Thomas Aquinas didn't know Greek, and yet, he's just reading Aristotle in Latin translation
Yeah.
and seemed to do a pretty good job. So it's like we don't always need that like expert level of knowledge in order to really develop some deep understanding.
Yeah. Right. You're right.
And such awkward times too. It's like, yeah, risking embarrassment. It's going to be embarrassing. We're trying to transition, away from this sort of civilization toward a different type of civilization, from a destructive civilization to an ecological civilization. It's going to look weird. We're going to embarrass ourselves.
Yeah.
Think of even people who are trying to live off the land more now. People are like, oh, let's relocalize food production. I'm going to start gardening. Like, yeah, you're going to mess up a bunch.
A lot.
And yeah, a lot. That's mostly my experience of gardening. I'm still in the messing up most of the time phase.
Right.
And so it's like, yeah,
Right.
that's okay. The amateur, if you love it, you're getting your hands in the soil, that's part of it. And yeah,
Right.
I like that a lot. Risk being amateurs, be okay with embarrassment. That's good advice.
I heard someone describe starting a business as going from problem to problem with enthusiasm, or obstacle, leaping from challenge to challenge with enthusiasm.
That's good.
Just expect that there will be things that come up and say, oh, okay, didn't know
Yeah.
that.
More obstacles, more problems. All right, on to the next one.
On to the next one. I think I'm middle age. That's life for me. That's not just academia or
Yeah.
ecology. That's raising children.
Right.
That's everything.
Yeah, right. That's the dukkha of life, right? It's like, yeah, we go from suffering to suffering, but do it with enthusiasm, with compassion. Or,
Right.
it's the cruciform life. It's
Right.
just, it's difficulty after difficulty, but this is the work.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I love it. Risk being amateurs. That's gonna. I'll be thinking about that for a while, for sure.
Thanks.
Well, Dan Scheid, thanks so much for making time for us, and I'll let you go now because that was such a good note to end on. Otherwise, we get back into all the problems again and,
Exactly.
and
Right.
lose
Yeah.
the
Yeah. I
lose
like
the
to end on a high
enthusiasm. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for hanging out, and thanks to people for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you, and in the meantime, take care and be well.